I entitled my first talk, The Terrible Truth, and this second one is entitled The Message. I look upon suffering as one of God's ways of getting our attention. In fact, C.S. Lewis calls pain God's megaphone. He said, God speaks to us in our conscience. I think I've got that wrong. C.S. Lewis said, God whispers to us in our conscience, speaks to us in our joys, and shouts to us in our pain. Pain is God's megaphone. And I'd like for us to think about some of the things which God needs to say to us, that he needs to get our attention for, first of all. And it's interesting to me, it's of great significance, I think, that as far as we know, the oldest book in the Bible, the book of Job, is the one that deals most specifically and head-on with the subject of suffering. You remember that Job was called a blameless man, that righteous man. God himself said that Job was a blameless man, and if the morality of those days was that a good man would be blessed and an evil man would be punished, then Job's experience seemed to turn that completely upside down. And Job lost everything. You remember that there was a drama that went on behind the scenes that, as far as we know, Job was never given a clue about, where Satan challenged God in heaven, and he said, of course Job trusts you, but does he trust you for nothing? Try taking away all those blessings and then see where Job's faith goes. And God accepted Satan's challenge. And here we have a mystery which we cannot begin to explain. In fact, it was God who called Satan's attention to that individual, Job, and he gave Satan permission to take things away from Job. And so he lost his flocks and his herds and his servants and his sons and his daughters and his house, and finally even the confidence of his wife. And as he sat on his ash heap, and his health had been touched by that time, and he was scraping himself with potsherds and in utter anguish and misery, he kept silence for 7 days as his friends, as they were called, sat there and looked at him and apparently didn't say anything either for 7 days. And when Job finally broke silence, he howled his complaints at God. We hear Job called a patient man, but if you read the book of Job, you won't really find a lot of evidence that he was patient, but he never doubted that God existed. And he said some of the very worst things that could possibly be said about God. And isn't it interesting that the Spirit of God preserved those things for you and me? God is big enough to take anything that we can dish out to him, and he even saw to it that Job's howls and complaints were preserved in black and white for our instruction. So never hesitate to say what you really feel to God, because remember that God knows what you think before you know, and certainly knows what you're going to say before you even think it. So for some samples of these dreadful things that this patient man Job said to God, how about Job chapter 3, verses 11, 19, and 20, where he says, "Why was I not stillborn? Why did I not die when I came out of the womb? Why should the sufferer be born to see the light? Why is life given to men who find it so bitter?" You see Job here dialoguing with God. There is no question in Job's mind throughout this entire book of the existence of God. He knows that it is God with whom he has to deal. Somebody is behind all this, he's saying. And the question why presupposes that there is reason, that there is a mind behind all that may appear to be mindless suffering. We would never ask the question why if we really believed that the whole of the universe was an accident and that you and I are completely at the mercy of chance. The very question, why, even if it is flung at us by one who calls himself an unbeliever or an atheist, is a dead giveaway that there is that sneaking suspicion in the back of every human mind that there is some body, some reason, some thinking individual behind this. And then Job addresses God directly in the 10th chapter, and he says, "Can't you take your eyes off me? Won't you leave me alone long enough to swallow my spit? You shaped me and made me. Now you've turned to destroy me. You kneaded me like clay, and now you are grinding me to a powder." Anybody ever felt like that? Does that ring any bells out there? God is grinding me to a powder. He doesn't give me a chance to swallow my spit. And then, of course, his friends, who are very orthodox, they never say a word that is not theologically sound, they begin to accuse him of foolish notions, a belly full of wind, they say. Job is utterly lacking in the fear of God, and he is pitting himself against the Almighty, charging him head down like an angry bull. Then Job calls Eliphaz a windbag. This is, the pot calling the kettle black. But his friends and enemies, he says, can't hold a candle to God, who has, quote, "set upon me and mauled me, seized me by the neck and worried me. He set me up as his target. His arrows rained upon me from every side. He is pitiless. He cut deep into my vitals. He spilt my gall on the ground." Now, can you top that? Would you dare to say such things aloud? And then Job asks God question after question after question, and at one point he says, if I ask him 1,000 questions, he won't even answer one of them. And he was right. Remember that when God finally breaks his silence, God does not answer a single question. God's response to Job's questions is mystery. In other words, God answers Job's mystery with the mystery of himself. And he starts right in snowing poor Job with questions. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the world? Have you seen the treasures of the snow? Have you walked in the great deep? Do you know where the wild ass gives birth? Have you presided over the doe in labor? And he goes on and on and on, question after question after question. But what he's doing is revealing to Job who he is. And as I said in my first talk, God, through my own troubles and sufferings, has not given me explanations, but he has met me as a person, as an individual. And that's what we need. Who of us in the worst pit that we've ever been in needs anything as much as we need company? Just somebody, perhaps, who will sit there in silence, but just be with us. Job never denies God's existence, never imagines that God has nothing to do with his troubles, but has 1,000 questions, and so do we. And let me just tell you a story or two that comes out of my first year as a missionary. I thought of myself as being very well prepared to be a missionary. As I told you, I came from a strong Christian home. My parents had been missionaries themselves, and we had dozens, probably hundreds of missionaries traipsing through our house. We had a guest room which always seemed to be full. We had suitcases bumping up and down the stairs all the time, and we listened from our earliest memories to many, many missionary stories at our own dinner table. And I went to a school for missionaries' children, which was here in Orlando, as a matter of fact. And I heard thousands of missionary talks. I looked at tens of thousands of terribly bad missionary slides and sort of lived, ate, breathed, drank missionaries, and turned out to be a missionary myself, as were 4 of my other brothers and sisters. There were 6 of us in the family. 5 of us turned out to be missionaries of one sort or another, and the 6th is a professor in Christian colleges. Anyway, I thought that I was probably God's gift to the mission field as a missionary and had all this training behind me. I went to a Bible school and I had some home missionary work and Canadian Sunday school mission, etc., etc. But within the first year, God saw fit to give me 3 major blows to what I thought was a very well-founded and very sinewy faith. And the first of these was that a man by the name of Macario, who was my informant as I was attempting to learn an unwritten Indian language in the western jungle of Ecuador, the language of the Colorado tribe, a very small tribe who had never had any written language and therefore had none of the Bible in their language. I had prayed that God would give me an informant, someone who would be prepared to sit down with me and go over and over and over what for him was the easiest language in the world, and have the patience to deal with this apparently retarded foreigner. And God answered my prayer by sending me this man by the name of Macario, who was bilingual, which was an enormous advantage. He spoke Spanish and Colorado, and I had had to learn Spanish as the national language of the country. And so we worked together very happily for about 6 weeks or 2 months. I've forgotten exactly what it was. And I was on my knees one morning in my bedroom, as was my habit, reading my Bible and praying. And I happened to be reading in the 3rd chapter or the 4th chapter of 1 Peter. And these were the words, "Think it not strange concerning the fiery trial that is to try you, as though some strange thing happened. It happens to give you a share in the sufferings of Christ." And at that very point, I heard gunshots. There was nothing unusual about gunshots in that particular clearing of the jungle. We were surrounded by Indians who hunted with guns that they had bought from the white man. And there were white people also in that clearing who hunted as well. So we often heard gunshots, but these particular ones were followed by yelling and screaming and horses galloping and people running and general pandemonium. So I rushed outside to hear that Macario had just been murdered. Now, it would be very nice if I could tell you that I easily found another informant, but the truth was that Macario was literally the only person in the world who was capable of doing the job that he had been doing with me. Nobody else knew both Spanish and Colorado. So I was faced, for the first time in my personal experience, with that awful why. Like Job, I didn't doubt for a second that God was up there, that God knew what he was doing. But I couldn't imagine what he could possibly have in mind. And God's answer to my why was trust me. No explanations, just trust me. That was the message. Now, if I had had a faith which was determined that God had to give me a particular kind of answer to my particular prayers, that faith would have disintegrated. But my faith had to be founded on the character of God himself. And so what looked like a contradiction in terms, God loves me, God lets this awful thing happen to me. What looked like a contradiction in terms, I had to leave in God's hands and say, okay, Lord, I don't understand it, I don't like it, but I only had 2 choices. He is either God or he's not. I am either held in the everlasting arms or I'm at the mercy of chance, and I have to trust him or deny him. Is there any middle ground? I don't think so. That cross uplifted high. What is this great symbol of the Christian faith? It's a symbol of suffering. That is what the Christian faith is about. It deals head-on with this question of suffering, and no other religion in the world does that. Every other religion in some way evades the question. Christianity has at its very heart this question of suffering. It comes, the answer to our prayers, teach me what it meaneth, in the cross be my glory ever, beneath the cross of Jesus. The answer comes not in the form of a revelation or an explanation or a vision, but in the form of a person who comes to you and me in our sorrow. And he says, trust me. Walk with me. I have to insert in here another little grandchild story, and you're going to have to bear with me. You know, grandmothers do tell grandchild stories, but they seem so appropriate so often. And in this particular case, my little 4-year-old granddaughter, Christiana, had to be spanked 3 times in one day for the same offense. She had not come running quickly when she was called. And my daughter, like my mother, treated, as my mother treated delayed obedience as disobedience, Valerie tries to do the same thing, and so Christiana was spanked 3 times on that particular Sunday. So Sunday night, when it was time to go to church, and she was called, she came charging out to the car, tears pouring down her face, her arms full of a Bible, a notebook, a pen, 4 years old, mind you. On her way to church, had to have a Bible, notebook, a pen, her barrettes, her necklaces, her bracelets, her hair ribbons, and who knows what else was essential. All this stuff falling out of her arms. She was tripping over things, tears pouring down her face, and she stopped and she said, "Oh, Mama, if only Adam and Eve hadn't sinned." Now that child was suffering because she lives in a fallen world, and you and I live in that same fallen world. We have to look at these awful facts. The fact of sin and suffering and death, the fact that God created a world in which those things were possible, the fact that He does love us. That means He wants nothing less than our perfection and joy, that He gave us the freedom to choose, and that man decided that his own idea of perfection and joy was better than God's, and believed what Satan told him. And therefore sin and suffering entered into the world. And now we're saying, why doesn't God do something about it? And the Christian answer is, He did. He became the victim, a lamb slain from before the foundation of the world. George Herbert, another 17th century poet, wrote this: "Afflictions sorted, anguish of all sizes, fine nets and stratagems to catch us in." And then George MacDonald, a 19th century poet, said this: "Pain with dog and spear hounds false faith from human hearts." 2 different expressions of what God is up to. Fine nets and stratagems to catch us in, to give us this message. And as the psalmist said in Psalm 46, though the mountains shake and be carried, though the earth shake and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, God is our refuge. And I speak to you as one who has desperately needed a refuge. And in that same psalm, he says, "Be still." And I'm told that it's legitimate to translate that, "Shut up and know that I am God." That's the message.